All right, this is Section 3, Lecture 2. We're going to continue talking about elements of realist theory in international relations. So, we've talked about the tenets of realism and anarchy and the consequences then that a governmentless international system may lead to. Let's talk about other consequences for nation state behavior, and these feed into those 5 points that we talked about with anarchy as well. If a country has to help itself, if it has to protect itself, if it has to think about its relative power versus others, what are the consequences for nation state behavior that we've seen play out in U.S. foreign policy is an idea that is called the balance of power theory. And just like our discussion on anarchy comes from Kenneth Waltz, Theory of International Politics, 1979, this discussion about balancing power comes from him as well. As we said before, countries have the same basic functions. Nation states are unitary actors that seek at a minimum their own preservation of security and a maximum, perhaps, world domination. There's power seeking and they act rationally. If you find yourself in this situation of having to think about your power versus others, relative to others, you can balance against others in order to maintain your security. And there are two means of balancing against the power of other nation states. Internally, nations can redirect their resources to expand the size of their militaries and their economies. Industries and economics feeds into military expansion. Externally, nation states can balance against the power of others by forming alliances with other nations. Why is this behavior so consequential? Well, in theory at least, it keeps countries from fighting with one another. It keeps other nation states, other powerful nation states, at bay. Balance of power theory is this: when the international system consists of nation states that are roughly equal in their military power, there will be security and perhaps peace. And this is a focus on the relative power of one country versus the other. So let's say there are two countries that we're talking about. They are perhaps opponents of one another. Realism and anarchy would lead us to believe that that is going to be the case. And so then, how can a country protect itself and maintain its power and independence? Well, if country A is equal to country B, balance of power theory says this leads to security. Country A will recognize rationally and in its own self-interest that when it comes to conflicts with country B, it cannot win. The best that it could do if it gets in a fight with country B is to come to a stalemate, and that is because country B has the same military and economic capabilities, has as much power then as country A. And so this rough parity, this rough equality in power between those two nation states leads them to recognize that they won't win if they get into a fight with one another, if they get into a war with one another. And so if a nation state wants to protect itself from other countries in the world, if it wants to help itself and preserve its place, it needs to be equal to the next most powerful nation state in the world. That equality is going to lead to security. The opposite of this is an inequality that's going to lead to insecurity. If country A is greater in its power than country B, country A has that power, has that influence, has that ability to dictate policies and behaviors to country B. And this leads to insecurity then for country B. I have down here at the bottom that the consequence for behavior is that deterrence rather than aggression is encouraged. And balance of power theory is based on the idea of deterrence. Deterrence means to deter another country from attacking you or invading you, to keep it away. Well, we've seen this play out in our foreign policy history. And if you remember back to our chapter on history, you'll hopefully remember these ideas. The Truman Doctrine was about the containment of the spread of Soviet power, the containment of communism. And we said that that played out not just in the Truman administration, but really all the way through the Reagan administration. Well, during that time, we were balancing against the power, the military might, and the economic might of the Soviet Union. And for that long stretch of the Cold War world, we had then this balance of power. Also, if we look at our behavior in joining alliances and building alliances, those external means of balancing, the United States and Western allies joined in NATO to balance against the Soviet Union. We joined in alliances with Japan and South Korea, also Australia and New Zealand, ANZUS, to balance against the spread of Soviet power. We have joined in alliances with Taiwan to balance against the spread of Chinese power, just as examples in our foreign policy history. So if we look at this graph from your textbook, figure 2.2, we see then a balance of power. It's called a bipolar, two large nation states or sets of alliances that define the Cold War era. The United States and its allies versus the Soviet Union and its allies. During this time, militarily, the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies were in this back and forth of military superiority. But economic superiority has always been in the advantage of the United States and its allies. One other augmentation or version of realist theory is in opposition to balance of power. If you really want to protect yourself as a nation state, to help yourself as a nation state, you don't balance against the power of others. You have to be absolutely more powerful than others. And this is an idea called power preponderance. One of its proponents is John Mearsheimer, and he has a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And he argues that countries don't just seek to balance against the power of others. They want to maximize their power in an absolute sense. They want to have absolute dominance over others. Here, rationality still plays a role. You're still keeping other nation states from attacking you or deterring other nation states from attacking you, based on the assumption that if you're that much more powerful than them, they'll recognize that they can't win. And if they recognize that they can't win, they'll be deterred then from attacking you. And so, how much power is enough? Well, Mearsheimer says global dominance. He measures power in military capabilities. And so here are the basics of power preponderance theory. Insecurity or war, he says, are most likely to occur when nation states have roughly equal military capabilities. This is the opposite of the balance of power. In the balance of power, a rough equality leads both sides to recognize that if they fought with one another, there would be most likely a stalemate as an outcome. Both sides then would, seeing that they can't win, be deterred from fighting. Well, power preponderance says it's when you are most closely associated in power with another nation state that you're going to fight with them, because you see the potential for victory, perhaps with a surprise attack or slightly better technology, slightly more spending, slightly more military troops or equipment. Power preponderance theorists would say the only time that a country is really going to be safe is when it has an absolute dominance over other nation states. If it holds this place of hegemony that we discussed in chapter 1. So if A is vastly dominant to B, this then will lead to security, at least for A. And power preponderance theorists argue that military dominance then is encouraged. This is the only way to keep other nation states from attacking you. The recognition that they can't win in the face of your power. We see this also in the history of U.S. foreign policy. Our current grand strategy is called sustained primacy. This is the basis of power preponderance theory. Primacy being number one, having that place of hegemony in the world. If we want to maintain our influence and our power in the world, we have to maintain military dominance, that much more greater than any other country, and economic dominance as well. If you remember back to chapter 1 or our first lectures, you'll remember this idea is as it plays out in fact, that the country that has the greatest level of military spending far beyond any others, the greatest levels of technology, the largest Navy, the largest Air Force, the second largest Air Force, is the United States. And this underlies our current grand strategy of sustained primacy, having that preponderance or dominance of power over others. We saw this begin to emerge initially in the Reagan administration. If you remember our discussions of presidential doctrines, from President Truman through President Reagan, the balance of power theory of containing communism was dominant. But during the Reagan administration, there was this shift, not a desire to balance against the Soviet Union, but to dominate it. And during the Reagan administration, we saw the buildup of our military, particularly technologically, referred to as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this was seen to, or at least in a desire to, make ourselves that much more powerful than the Soviet Union, make their nuclear weapons almost obsolete if we can defend ourselves from them. We'll talk quite a bit more about the Strategic Defense Initiative in chapter 10 when we talk about national security policy. So here's a chart from your book that shows then power preponderance. If we look at the end of the Cold War era, that was the end of the balance of power notion. From 1991 through the present, the United States has been dominant over other nation states, economically, militarily especially. And so then, this figure demonstrates U.S. hegemony, but also the idea of the U.S. having power preponderance. One of the other changes or shifts in balance of power theory is called power transition theory. Now, we mentioned this in the beginning lectures as a potential threat to the future place of the United States in the world. These authors I have listed here, Organski and Kugler, in their book, The War Ledger, talked about the balance of power theory, talked about power preponderance theory, and they said the problem with these theories is that they're static. They're just sort of like snapshots at any given time. But nation states aren't seen just at one time. They're seen on a continuum of time. And so you don't necessarily need to focus on a snapshot of balancing power or power preponderance, but the dynamic balance, the changing balance of power over time. And they argued that over time, power will shift or transition between countries. One will be more powerful than another militarily, economically at different points. This goes back to the ideas of the power transition theory that we talked about in the first lectures. It goes back to the idea of the law of uneven growth. Newly industrializing nation states grow much more rapidly than early industrializing nation states. And so this is what we see as a result of a dynamic balance of power. So this is a similar graph, or maybe the same graph that I had up in the first or earlier lectures. You see over time, country A, let's call it the United States, is growing in its power, in its wealth, let's say. But later on, country B industrializes, begins to build its military, and uses then the peace, the security, the economic markets that country A is established in order to grow much more rapidly, much more quickly, and then perhaps much greater than country B. And so power transition theory says that you have to not just worry about a snapshot of balancing power or your dominance in any one time. It has to be on this continuum. It has to be perpetual. And that the threat of war is around those times when the convergence or the transition between country A and country B occur. War would occur before country B surpasses country A, because country A would want to keep country B weak. Or war would be more likely to occur when country B surpasses country A, and country B then challenges country A for dominance in the international system. And so power transition theory or power shift theory argues the same idea of power preponderance, that you have to perpetuate your dominance over other nation states. So this is the same slide that we had from section 3, lecture 1, talking about realism. The same consequences for U.S. foreign policy that we saw from the basic tenets of realism and anarchy, we can see then historically with the balance of power and power preponderance, all of these ideas build on one another. We have to focus on our national security and balance of power, our national security, our military might, our military spending, our allies' militaries had to balance against other nation states, and particularly the Soviet Union. In power preponderance, we still have to focus on all of those points, but we want to be that much more dominant than other nation states. That's our current grand strategy of sustained primacy, sustained dominance in the world. And so these same consequences that come from the basic tenets of realism also come from these other elements or theories associated with realist theory.